Everything you've been hearing about the Browns' quarterback situation might not be true, because for weeks, the conversation has been all over the place. Different names, different theories, different timelines. It felt messy, unclear, like nobody really knew what was going on. But now, that confusion is starting to clear up, because an NFL insider just revealed something that cuts through all the noise. This isn't a wide-open quarterback situation. This isn't some long-term guessing game. It's a direct battle. Shedeur Sanders versus Deshaun Watson. And that changes everything. Because if that's the reality, then everything else we've been hearing starts to look very different. So now the real question is who's competing? Why has the story been so wrong this entire time? Here, where everything starts to make sense. Because for the first time, we're getting clarity. Not speculation. Not guesses. Actual direction. According to insider reports, the Browns aren't juggling multiple quarterback scenarios like people have been saying. They've already narrowed it down. It's Shedeur Sanders. It's Deshaun Watson. And that's it. Now think about what that means. Because for weeks, the conversation felt crowded. You kept hearing different names being thrown in. Different possibilities. Different what-if scenarios. It created this idea that the Browns didn't really know what they were doing. Like everything was still undecided. But that wasn't reality. That was noise. Because when a team actually identifies its competition this clearly, it means decisions have already been made internally. They've evaluated the roster. They've looked at the options. And they've decided who matters. And more importantly, who doesn't. That's why this is such a big shift. Because it completely removes the illusion of chaos. This isn't a five-way battle. This isn't a long-term waiting game. This is immediate. 2 quarterbacks, 1 job, and a decision that's going to shape the direction of this franchise moving forward. But here's the part people aren't fully processing yet. This isn't just about competition. It's about opportunity. Because when a young quarterback like Shedeur Sanders is put directly into a head-to-head situation with a veteran like Watson, that's not accidental. That's intentional. Teams don't do that unless they believe the player is capable. Because otherwise, you don't risk it. You don't create that kind of dynamic. You protect the veteran. You ease the rookie in. But that's not what's happening here. They're putting them side by side, letting them compete, letting them prove it. And that tells you everything, because it shows confidence, real confidence, not public hype, not media talk, internal belief, the kind that only exists when a team sees something in a player that others might not fully understand yet. And that's what makes this moment important. Because now the situation is clear. The competition is real. And the path is defined. But here where things take a turn. Because if the reality is this simple, why has the conversation been so complicated? Why has the media been pushing so many different narratives? That's where things start to get a little messy. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because once the real situation starts coming out, you have to ask, why did it look so different before? For weeks, the conversation around the Browns felt chaotic. Different reporters saying different things. Different storylines popping up almost daily. One day it's a wide-open QB room. Next day it's long-term uncertainty. Then suddenly, new names get thrown into the mix. It never stayed consistent. And that's the first red flag. Because when information is real, it usually lines up. But when it does, That's when you're dealing with something else. And according to voices close to the situation, that's exactly what's been happening. There's been a disconnect, not just between fans and reality, but inside the media itself. Some reporters are working with actual information. Others, they're filling gaps, trying to keep the story moving even when there's nothing concrete to report. And that's how narratives get created. Because in a situation where teams aren't leaking much, silence becomes a problem, and silence doesn't trend. So what happens? Speculation fills the space. Ideas get repeated. Assumptions turn into talking points. And those talking points start sounding like facts, even when they're not. That's the cycle. And once it starts, it's hard to stop. Because now, multiple voices are saying similar things. Not because they all have the same information, but because they're all reacting to each other, echoing the same ideas, reinforcing the same narrative, until it feels real, even if it never had a solid foundation to begin with. And that's what makes this situation so interesting. Because now that insider clarity is starting to come out. That entire structure begins to crack. Because suddenly, the story doesn't match. The wide-open competition doesn't match. The uncertain future doesn't match. The extra names being added don't match. And once that happens, you can't unsee it. You start questioning everything. Every report, every headline, every source says moment. Because now you realize, not all information is equal. Some of it is real. Some of it is constructed. And the challenge is figuring out which is which. But here, where it gets even more revealing. Because once you understand how these narratives are built, you start noticing patterns, specific patterns, in how things are said, in how stories are structured, and in how certain ideas keep getting repeated. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to ignore. Once you start paying attention, the pattern becomes obvious and honestly a little unsettling. Because these stories don't just appear randomly, they follow a structure. The same phrases show up, the same angles get repeated, and the same conclusions somehow keep coming back, even when there's no new information to support them. That's not coincidence, that's construction. Think about how the narrative around the Browns kept evolving. It didn't jump from one clear report to another. It slowly shifted. One idea gets introduced, then another voice repeats it. Then a third adds a slight variation. And before you know it, that idea feels established, even though it never came from a solid, confirmed source in the first place. That's how talking points are built. Not from facts, but from repetition. And you can actually see it in how people talk about the situation. There's a certain rhythm to it, almost like it's been rehearsed. Certain explanations feel too polished, too clean, like they've been said multiple times before, especially when it comes to explaining things like Shedeur Sanders' draft fall or the so-called competition in the quarterback room. It sounds structured, not discovered. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean every report is fake, but it does mean not every report is original. Some are reactions, some are interpretations, and some are just extensions of a narrative that's already been set in motion. And once that narrative gains traction, it becomes the default lens through which everything is viewed. That's why even normal developments start to feel like drama. A standard quarterback competition suddenly becomes controversy. A routine comment becomes tension. A simple roster decision turns into long-term uncertainty. It's not that the events themselves are dramatic, it's how they're framed. And here's the key detail most people miss. Once a narrative is established, it becomes self-sustaining. People stop questioning where it came from. They just react to it. They debate it. They spread it. And that gives it more power than the actual facts. But now that structure is starting to break. Because when insider clarity comes in and simplifies everything, when it reduces the situation down to something real, something direct, it exposes how complicated the story was made to feel before. And that contrast is hard to ignore. Because if the truth is simple, then why did it sound so complex? And that question leads to something even bigger. Because once you start questioning the structure, you start questioning the origin. And this is where everything starts to feel even more questionable. Because once you understand how narratives are built, you go back and look at one of the biggest moments. The draft. Shedeur Sanders falling to the 5th round. And suddenly, it doesn't feel as straightforward as it was presented. Because think about it. A quarterback with proven production, strong leadership, real experience under pressure. And yet, he drops that far. That doesn't just happen without a reason. At least that's what people were told. But here, where things get interesting. The explanations never really stayed consistent. At first, it was about fit. Then it was about system concerns. Then it shifted into reports suggest there were questions about intangibles. Then even vague character concerns started getting mentioned. But none of it was ever clearly defined. Nothing concrete. Nothing directly confirmed. Just layers of speculation building on top of each other. And once you notice that, it becomes hard to ignore. Because real concerns usually come with specifics. Clear examples. Clear reasoning. But this felt different. It felt like a narrative trying to justify an outcome after it already happened, instead of explaining it beforehand. And that's a big difference. Because when a player falls unexpectedly, people start looking for answers. And when there aren't clear answers available, they create them. They fill in the gaps. They connect dots that may not actually be connected, until the story feels complete, even if it's not fully accurate. And that's what this situation is starting to look like. Because now, when you hear insiders talk, when you see analysts revisit the evaluation, the tone is different. Less certainty about those earlier concerns. More focus on actual ability. More emphasis on what he can do on the field. And that shift matters, because it suggests something important. The original narrative might not have been as solid as people thought. And if that's true, then everything built on top of it starts to lose weight, including the way people are still evaluating him today. Because if the draft position was influenced by perception, then using that same position to judge his ability now doesn't really make sense. And that's where things start to flip. Because now, instead of asking, why did he fall? The better question becomes, what if that fall never reflected the real player in the first place? And if that's the case, then what we're about to see next might completely change how this entire situation is viewed. And this is where the story stops being about the past and starts becoming about what's actually going to happen next. Because regardless of how the narrative was built, regardless of where he was drafted, Shedeur Sanders now has something that matters more than anything else. A real opportunity. And not just any opportunity. A clear one. A defined one. A direct path to proving everything people have been debating. Because this isn't a situation where he's buried on the depth chart. This isn't a slow development plan where he waits years for a chance. He's in a real competition against Deshaun for the starting job. And that changes everything. Because now, there's no more hiding behind narratives. No more speculation. No more we'll see in the future. It's happening now. And that kind of situation forces clarity. Because when two quarterbacks are competing directly, the evaluation becomes simple. Who executes better? Who leads better? Who makes the offense work? That's it. No outside noise can change that. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because the environment around him is improving too. The Browns aren't just sitting back and hoping things work. They're building, adjusting the system, strengthening protection, creating a structure that allows the quarterback to actually operate. And that matters more than people think. Because a quarterback's performance is directly tied to what's around him. Give him time, give him structure, give him support, and suddenly everything looks different. And that's exactly what's happening here. Which means this opportunity isn't just real. It's fair. And that's the key. Because now, whatever happens next, it can't be dismissed. It can't be explained away. If he performs, it's real. If he wins the job, it's earned. And if he proves the earlier narratives wrong, there's no way to ignore it. And that's why this moment is so important. Because everything we've talked about, the media confusion, the draft slide, the shifting opinions, all of it leads to this. A clean stage, a clear competition, and a chance to finally separate perception from reality. But here's the part that makes it even bigger. Because once that opportunity turns into results, the narrative doesn't just change, it collapses. And this is where everything begins to shift, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that's impossible to ignore if you're paying attention. Because once real opportunity meets real performance, narratives don't hold up the same way anymore. They start to weaken, they start to lose structure, and eventually they collapse under their own weight. That's exactly what's starting to happen here. The same storyline that once felt strong, crowded quarterback room, unclear direction, long-term uncertainty, is now being quietly replaced by something much simpler. A direct competition, a defined path, a situation that no longer needs layers of explanation. And when things become that clear, all the earlier complexity starts to look artificial. You can already see it in how the conversation is changing. The tone is softer. The certainty is gone. What used to sound like strong opinions are now turning into cautious statements. Instead of "this is what's happening," it's becoming "we'll have to see." And that shift says everything. Because it shows that the people who once pushed those earlier ideas are starting to pull back, slowly adjusting without fully admitting it. And that's how narratives fade. Not through one big moment, but through small corrections over time. A headline here changes tone. A report there becomes less confident. A comparison that once felt important suddenly stops getting mentioned, until eventually it disappears completely. And when that happens, it's like it was never real to begin with. But here, what makes this situation different? The collapse isn't happening because of new speculation. It's happening because reality is starting to simplify everything. Because when you reduce a situation down to actual competition, actual reps, actual performance, there's no room left for inflated stories. Everything becomes visible. Everything becomes measurable. And that's what exposes the gap between what was said and what actually is. Because if the reality was always this straightforward, then all the extra layers, the added names, the complicated scenarios, the constant uncertainty, they weren't necessary. They were added, built, pushed into the conversation to fill space that didn't need filling. And once people start realizing that, it changes how they see everything else. Because now, they're not just watching the quarterback battle, they're watching how the story around it was created in the first place. And that awareness is powerful. Because once you see how narratives are formed, you stop accepting them at face value. And now we're reaching the point where that awareness meets results, where everything that's been discussed, debated, and questioned finally gets tested in the only place that matters. And when that happens, there's no interpretation left, no framing, no spin, just reality. And when reality shows up, it doesn't ask for permission to replace the story. And now everything comes down to this moment. Because after all the noise, all the narratives, all the speculation, there's nowhere left to hide. Because at the end of the day, football has a way of simplifying everything. It doesn't care about headlines. It doesn't care about draft position. It doesn't care about what was said months ago. It only cares about one thing: what happens on the field. And that's exactly where this story is heading. Because once the season begins, once the reps become real, once the competition plays out in front of everyone, everything we've talked about gets tested instantly. No filters, no narratives, no protection, just performance. And that's what makes this situation so important. Because for Shedeur Sanders, this isn't just another opportunity. It's a reset, a chance to redefine how he's viewed, to separate himself from everything that was said before he even got here. And if he delivers, if he steps into that role and performs the way some insiders are starting to believe he can, then the entire conversation flips completely. The same voices that questioned will adjust. The same narratives that created doubt will disappear. And the same story that once felt complicated will suddenly look very simple. But here's the part that really matters. This doesn't feel random. It doesn't feel like a lucky break. It feels earned, built through preparation, through pressure, through everything that led up to this moment. And that's why this feels different. Because when a player reaches this point, when preparation meets opportunity in a real, defined situation, results usually follow. And when they do, they don't just change opinions, they rewrite the entire story. So now the question is what people are saying anymore. It's what's about to happen next. Because very soon, we're going to find out what was real all along.